Welcome to the Barbara Christensen podcast. The views expressed during this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the streaming services or the host, and these are being shared for entertainment possibilities only. Please connect with your doctor before taking on any new wellness activities, changing your diet or supplementation routine. Barbara Christensen is a certified personal trainer holding a diploma in nutrition and additional certifications in aromatherapy, Reiki, and other energetic and therapeutic modalities. This podcast will open your mind to the tools to clear the chaos from your life, from your body, release the beliefs in your being, activate your awareness, and remove any blocks holding you back from the life you want to live. Now let's get started. I asked the celestial mirror to create an image based on what I saw in the cosmos today, and what you're seeing is it. Profound moments of magic is where I see us today. Today we have the South Node sextile Chiron at only 0 degrees 19 as an important personal and ancestral healing strand woven into the much larger Neptune-Pluto evolutionary atmosphere. Neptune sextile Pluto describes the deep field of dissolution and regeneration. The South Node Chiron sextile describes one of the psychological mechanisms through which we can participate in that field consciously. In archetypal astrology, we make an important distinction between world transits, which correlate symbolically with collective developments, and personal transits. So rather than treating these configurations as being deterministic type causes, we can read them as these different layers of the same symbolic moment. It's important here to consider, where are these in your chart? How is this impacting you in this transit? Neptune-Pluto is moving through the work of dissolving, composting, and then regeneration. Neptune and Pluto together carry an extraordinary depth quality. Neptune dissolves boundaries, identities, ideas, and structures whose meanings have been, let's say, exhausted. Pluto takes us beneath the surface into death and rebirth, shadow, compulsion, power, and regeneration. In sextile, I wouldn't frame this as the universe is taking things away from you. It feels more subtle. Instead, I would say, ask yourself what has already completed its psychological life cycle and what can become permeable enough to be released. I think that matters because letting go isn't necessarily an act of will. Sometimes our difficulty releasing something comes from the fact that it once protected us, gave us belonging, or helped construct an identity. Neptune can soften the boundary around that identity, while Pluto asks what remains alive underneath it. And then the nodes in Chiron make this considerably more intimate. South Node sextile Chiron is the wound contained in the familiar. In today's chart, that South Node is at 0 degrees 31 Virgo and Chiron at 0 degrees 51 Taurus. This creates an exceptionally close sextile. Virgo, the embedded self, and Taurus, the field between the stubborn masculine transactions and the burning Venetian heart. The South Node symbolically points towards what is already known: established patterns, inherited strategies, familiar identities, and ways of navigating our lives. This doesn't make the South Node bad. It can contain enormous competence, but we can remain attached to something simply because we know how to survive there. Chiron introduces the wounded healer archetype. So I would formulate the question created by this sextile as, what am I ready to stop carrying because I can finally understand what it was protecting? That's quite different from simply asking, what should I let go of? Let's consider the shadow aspect here. The Jungian shadow aspect considers this containing qualities that conscious identity has found unacceptable, while also emphasizing that the shadow isn't exclusively negative. Its valuable and positive capacities can actually be seen there as well. Additionally, we can frame transformation as bringing unconscious material into awareness so that our relationship to it can change. Not achieving perfection here, but moving towards wholeness. That distinction feels central to this transit. Release may come through integration rather than through rejection. And the signs that make the symbolism even richer is that both Chiron and the South Node are at 0 degrees of Earth signs. South Node in Virgo might symbolically expose old attachments to useful fixing, perfection, analysis, service, control through organization, or the belief that if I can just get this right, I'll finally be safe. Chiron in Taurus can bring the inquiry down into something much more embodied in terms of our worth, enoughness, security, resources, the body, stability, and our capacity simply to be without constantly earning our right to exist through productivity. That creates a compelling exchange. Virgo might say, what must I keep doing to remain safe, useful, and acceptable? Taurus might say, can I experience worth before I do anything at all? And because it's a sextile, there is an opening between them, a bridge, rather than necessarily a collision. Something previously experienced as a wound may now become a resource for releasing an old pattern. Neptune and Pluto completes this equation. I see almost an alchemical sequence here. South Node moving with Chiron towards Neptune moving with Pluto. The South Node remembers the pattern. Chiron reveals the tenderness underneath it. Neptune dissolves the identity that formed around it. Pluto composts what has been finished and returns its psychic energy to us. That last piece has a particularly strong connection to our shadow work. The repression requires psychic energy to maintain and suggest that bringing unconscious materials into our consciousness can release that trapped libido back into the psyche. So I think letting go under this configuration doesn't have to mean throwing something away. It can mean withdrawing the psychic energy required to keep an obsolete identity alive. And that is much more Plutonian. The 0 degree symbolism adds a threshold quality. I would also pay attention to the fact that both Chiron and the South Node have only just entered these signs. Symbolically, 0 degrees is a threshold, and the archetype is newly entering a different landscape. So there is something beautiful about an aspect concerned with the past occurring at the very moment of two signs. And as I'm saying this, Bonnie got up, Bonnie the dog, and walked in quite a few circles to sit down in the exact same place. So that makes me really think about what we're talking about here. There really is something beautiful about an aspect here concerned with the past, okay? Especially occurring at the very beginning of two signs. It suggests that paradox where we're encountering the old from an entirely new place. The South Node isn't necessarily saying that you're going backwards. I wrote down this. Consider this. Look once more at what you've carried forward. Now that you are standing somewhere different, can you see why you needed it? And if you no longer need it, can you bless the intelligence that created it and put it down? I think that is much closer to psychologically grounded shadow integration than that popular idea of cord cutting, although I do think that cord cutting has a place sometimes. This isn't about being uncomfortable. Allowing and emphasizing the shadow is not inherently evil, and by doing so, we might find where we contain healing energies, as well as where we contain destructive ones. So how can we somatically work with this transit? Rather than deciding intellectually what needs to disappear, I would instead allow the body to identify the pattern. Bring to mind one thing you believe you need to release, be it a role, an obligation, relationship pattern, expectation, identity, resentment, or way of proving yourself. Notice when your body contracts when you imagine releasing it. Then ask, what did this once do for me? And after allowing an answer to emerge, I would ask, what would I lose if I no longer needed this? That second question is to look at where Chiron lives. Because sometimes we aren't actually afraid of losing the pattern. We're afraid of meeting the vulnerable part of ourselves that the pattern has been protecting. Those of us born in between the 1940s and the 1990s are so deeply connected to this pattern of Neptune sextile Pluto. It is the maturity of our lifetime. And in the larger Neptune-Pluto field, perhaps that is precisely the invitation of not forcing an ending, but becoming conscious enough that an old structure no longer needs to hold us together. The deeper movement may therefore be less about the release of what no longer serves you and more about integrating what it once served so you become free to release the pattern. This feels to me like the real medicine of the South Node Chiron sextile within this much larger Neptune-Pluto passage. A lot to think about there. And a lot of this comes from not just, looking at the Jungian aspects, but we're also looking at some of the psychology from Hollis. And I want to name that. I want to name that we are not taking this all from a space of how do I say this? So we're not taking this from a space of things that never existed, but what exists in it. And I'm not sure if that makes sense. But this is quite frankly very embedded in and coherent with depth psychology, and it being created from the archetypal astrology depicting movement, it really is connective to old adaptive identities towards integration. The primary psychology is Jungian and archetypal astrology, especially the processes of shadow integration, individuation, projection withdrawal, symbolic death and rebirth, and the movement towards the self. And this fits very closely with Jungian source, which describes shadow work not as becoming perfect, but as bringing disintegrated or unconscious aspects into conscious personality and moving towards wholeness. So if I were to name the psychological layers here that are being expressed in this transit, we have shadow psychology, which is the crumbling face in darkness. In the image, it shows up as the fragmented figure, which represents aspects of identity that can no longer remain unconscious. Defenses, beliefs, rejected qualities, former adaptions, right? Importantly, Jungian shadow isn't about getting rid of negative qualities or labeling ourselves or our behaviors or our past as bad. There are positive qualities that can be relegated to our shadow. We also have attachment and protective adaptation, which is the chains. Psychologically, the chains can symbolize patterns that we remain bound to because they once created safety or belonging, predictability, protectiveness. It's interesting because I have been writing about something that I was trying to release in the new book that I'll be putting out, Unbreakable Spirit. And this was something that in the moment was very predictable, very protective, felt safe, gave me a space where I belonged, and yet also was a little bit toxic. And so therefore, we're not condemning the old patterns. We're asking whether the protection is still necessary. Do we still need to go back to that place? Neptune is showcasing the grief and the ego dissolution, because Neptune visually represents the psychological experience of allowing an identity, idealization, fantasy, or certainty to become less rigid. There can be grief in discovering that something we identified with no longer fits us. In the depth transformation, we have Pluto. And Pluto represents descent into material the ego would rather avoid, and eventually regeneration that becomes possible through actually encountering it. Psychologically, this is the image's death and rebirth motif, not literally death, but the ending of an ego or an organized identity. Chiron, of course, is that wounded healer archetype. And what I love about thinking about Virgo in this aspect is that we also have Virgo as the hermit, which sometimes is considered the wounded healer. And the wound isn't depicted as something that must simply disappear. The earth is wounded, and we don't want the earth to disappear. This is our home. This is where we live. This is Pachamama. This is what we want to embrace. Instead, it becomes a source of consciousness. And this is very close to the Jungian idea that unconscious material contains healing potential. When I was talking about the psychology that Hollis brings into it, there is an emphasis that shadow can contain healing as well as destructive energies. And that is very true of so many things in this world, but also of the world. We bring in here somatic psychology, which is still a very new and transformational space that is arriving more and more as we are discovering more and more how the body holds on to energy, as we are energy. And that's bringing in Taurus, the earth, the water, the lotus, the seated body. This isn't escaping up into the cosmos. This is learning to be seated and embodied, touching earth. Psychologically, transformation has to become felt rather than merely understood intellectually. As well, individualization, which is the path towards the light. This might be the most important psychological symbol in the entire imagery of the transit today. The path doesn't erase the darkness behind her. She carries the experience forward differently. Individualization means increasing relationship with the whole psyche rather than identifying exclusively with the acceptable parts of ourselves. There is a layer here of sitting between dissolution and renewal. You are not just standing at the end of the road here, especially because we still have quite a ways to go in terms of Neptune sextile Pluto. And there is still another nodal bind that will come in while we're going through this process. We're sitting at a threshold. That makes this psychologically stronger because transformation is represented as a state of conscious presence rather than achievement. On the one side, we have fragmentation and release. On the other, flowering and integration. We're occupying the bridge, the middle, where we are witnessing both. We need to understand that holding the tension of opposites long enough is how something new emerges, rather than prematurely choosing one side. The psychological architecture that we might use in meditation as we go through this would be to walk ourselves through where is the protective adaptation of ourself? What is the shadow that we encounter? Where is the conscious wounding? What is the grief that's dissolving? How are we integrating? And how do we individualize this? What you integrate becomes freedom. That is really the psychological heart of this. We aren't asking you to destroy your old self. We're discovering why it existed and what it protected, what part of ourselves became trapped within it, and what psychic energy becomes available when we no longer have to maintain it. Repression becomes consuming psychic energy. Integration releases that energy back into the personality. And that really aligns with the personality is a part of that important aspect of human design. During a session yesterday, I found a client was suddenly so much more at ease with themselves to learn that, oh, this is my blueprint. I don't have to be upset that I require time to rest. That is part of my blueprint. And it's important to kind of consider that we are bringing the conscious personality into relationship with the embodied design here. There are conscious and unconscious dimensions within ourselves in terms of human design, but there are also conscious and unconscious dimensions that we have in the relationship to ourselves with our conscious personality in psychology. And this does create that beautiful bridge between human design and the Jungian individualization. This really fits well with Gate 10, which is coming to mind for me. Behavior of the self. And the higher expression is described as making choices that honor our inner truth and accepting oneself while living according to one's individuality. In the lower expression, it's adapting to others' expectations and losing sight of our own path. That's almost exactly what I would like you to meditate on as you connect to this transit in the 8-8 portal. The psychological human design process would be, what is the conditioning? What is my awareness? What is my deconditioning? What is the embodied self-trust? And how do I align? Human design would say, what remains when I stop organizing my life around conditioning? Today's human design actually is Gate 7, the role of the self, and Gate 13, the gate of the listener. So it kind of makes me think about, we're describing what happens after letting go process, after we move through that. So once conditioning loosens, what is the self actually here to orient towards? Gate 7, the role of the self. That belongs to the G center. So its symbolism immediately brings us into identity, direction, and our relationship to leadership. Gate 7 is the role of the self and associates to higher expression, recognizing other people's strengths, and guiding through influence rather than domination. That really makes it interesting being beside the South Node Chiron sextile that we've been discussing. The South Node asks us to notice what became familiar. Chiron exposes where familiarity may have formed around vulnerability. Neptune softens that identity, and Pluto asks for deeper transformation. So Gate 7 could be asking us, if I stop organizing my identity around an old wound, an old expectation, or an old survival strategy, what direction naturally emerges from the self? This is about orientation. And Gate 13, the listener, is also in the G center. The listener describes a higher expression as deep listening, holding space for other stories, learning from the past, allowing these stories to inform the future. In a lower expression, it can become overwhelming by what others disclose or by carrying burdens that aren't ours. So, Gate 7 asking us where we're going. Gate 13 might be saying, what have I learned from where I've been? This is direction. And this only comes because we have memory, even if that memory is only somatic. And so the South Node really becomes more relevant here. Because if we take the South Node and we connect it to that gate 13, it's about listening to the past without living there. And that may be the deeper psychological message of this moment. We do not have to erase our past to become free of it. In gate 13, we can listen to it. We can recognize that wound. And that means that we're sifting through things. It means we're creating discernment. And it means that you can hear someone else's story and not become responsible for carrying the story. This is about healthy boundaries. I feel that this is also aligned with where we're at today. I want to remind us that the cosmos really does connect to our body's intelligence and the deeper synthesis of where we are today. But also that the past becomes wisdom rather than identity. And that is a very different meaning of letting go.